Good afternoon, I'm Ken Burns. People have often asked me why, after more than 40 years of making films strictly about American history, would I executive produce documentaries on subjects like cancer and genetics, and now youth mental health. Why? Many of our films have, in their own way, dealt with mental health issues. Abraham Lincoln was severely depressed. Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark was bipolar. And of course, many tens of thousands of veterans of the Civil War, World War I and II, and Vietnam have suffered from PTSD and other health challenges. Today, our country is experiencing a mental health crisis, so the topic has to be confronted head-on. This collaboration between America's leading brain and mental health advocates, foundations, corporations, and philanthropists, this great production team, and of course PBS, can make a major contribution to raising awareness about this issue, and in the process give hope to countless people who have been reluctant, if not afraid, to ask for help. As a society, we continue to test the resiliency of youth without truly understanding how the stresses of today, including these unprecedented times, are impacting them. We've set out to listen to and to learn from America's young people, documenting their experiences, but also listening to how they are identifying new ways to address mental health challenges. It is a remarkable journey that we hope will capture the unique voices of these young people as they navigate an extraordinarily difficult moment in our country's history. We're very happy to share some early interview footage from this film in production. Thank you so much for your support of this important project.
The only thing I know how to do is to share my own story and my own experience. I can't tell anyone what they can't see for themselves, but I can tell them what it was like for me, what happened to me, and what it's like now that I have recognized my own illness.
It was something in the back of my head, really. It was not something that I didn't really worry about.
My dad was an alcoholic, and just like the anxiety of him coming home at night.
It's a strange thing to look back on and think to myself, I really didn't care about anything at that point.
I remember a lot of nights where I would sit in my bed and cry, like for hours after hours.
I felt a lot of pain inside, and I couldn't explain that. I couldn't relay that to other people outside.
The feeling is like walking through, it's like being pulled down, being pulled into like quicksand.
It affects my daily life all day, every day.
To go to school, you know, you put on a face, a facade, you're happy, you're bubbly, and then you eat lunch alone in the bathroom.
I started to self-harm. I learned it in a book that I read.
I'm tired of the voices. I'm tired of everybody labeling me and saying that I'm crazy.
What happens to people with a serious mental illness is that, just like a serious cancer, it begins to metastasize. It turns into disability.
I remember waking up and being in the psych ward and being like, what am I doing here? I had a very high opinion of myself.
It gets complicated by substance abuse.
Drugs and alcohol worked very well for me because they took that anxiety that I had and that sense of isolation, and they eliminated those things.
Drugs and drinking, and that was kind of my excuse, like that outside excuse to match up that feeling of powerlessness inside.
When I finally did like start to think like, oh, I'm probably an addict, I was like, no, like you're just lying to yourself, you know?
When the suicide rate goes up, nobody even knows about it.
I still had a whole future that I had planned, you know. It's like I was planning the suicide, but at the same time, you know, I was making plans to like go out to the movies with my friends the next week.
My life was gonna end one way, and that was being addicted to drugs, so why not start now?
Like I wasn't meant to be on this earth.
Long sleeves, no one knew what was on my wrists.
It was actually on social media. These boys were harassing me about something I did. I couldn't deal with it anymore. Yeah, I actually went through with it. I actually tried to hurt myself.
Those are the moments where I have the best opportunity to plant a seed in someone else's mind. The fact of the matter is, if you don't show some vulnerability, if you don't speak honestly, then there's no truth. And if there's no truth, there's no connection.
It's taken me a very, very long time to even speak openly about it. I think there's a lot of pressure in being vulnerable, especially now with social media and everyone judging you. My roommates don't even know half of this stuff that I'm telling you guys now. And I'm nervous, I'm kind of shaking inside to even talk about it. But if I can even reach 2 people from everything I say or this story, then I did my part in this world.
We don't understand how common it is. We don't understand how important it is to talk about it and be open about it. So this is the problem that we all deal with in secret. And the result is that we don't deal with it well.
Thank you for joining our discussion about mental health in communities of color and cultural stigmas. I'm William Padmore with NET and Nebraska's PBS and NPR. Shared experiences and family connections, values, music, and community and religious networks can all be great sources of strength and support, especially in communities of color. According to the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, shared experiences in communities of color can also include facing racism, discrimination, or inequity, and being treated as less than because of skin color, which can be stressful and even traumatizing. In Nebraska, the leading cause of death in ages 11 to 24 is suicide. You'll hear from a panel of mental health professionals as well as young adults sharing personal stories of their mental health journey. We'll also discuss practical skills and provide information to help you recognize the signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety that may lead to suicidal thoughts. Post your questions in the comment section and let us know your location. Before we begin, let's hear from Alex Carmona, a Mexican-American student suffering from anxiety and depression.
I have been dealing with mental illness for a little while now. It kind of started with anxiety. I remember being in middle school and dealing with anxiety. And from there, I think it kind of gradually got a little bit worse. I started dealing with depression. And from there, it started getting a little bit worse and just had thoughts of suicide, Being a person of color, I'm Hispanic. My parents are from Mexico. It's always kind of scary dealing with anxiety and depression. In a Hispanic household, they don't really know how to deal with stuff like that because I guess they never dealt with stuff like that, with anxiety and depression, and so it's always kind of kind of scary talking with my parents about it. I don't want to say they downplay it, but they don't fully understand it, I guess. My support system has been a couple of people, one of them being Mahatma Larispada. He works at the Latino Center of the Midlands. He's a student advocate at Bellevue West. He also is one of the lead facilitators with one of the groups, Olean. It's a youth group. We kind of talk about stuff like that, like anxiety, mental health illness, knowing your identity, confidence, being confident of who you are. It's kind of nice opening up to someone that that has also experience with stuff like that. I think it's more comfortable talking to someone that that has dealt with anxiety or depression. I like listening to music. It helps me take things off my mind, and just being able to just be alone by myself, listening to music and just relaxing and taking my mind off things. We're all human. We all experience anger. We all experience frustration. We all experience anxiety, whether you're Hispanic or African American or wherever you come from. I think being able to open up to your family about it, not hiding those things, and just telling them how you feel, and I think it's something that we should continue talking about is mental health. especially in the Latino community.
And now I would like to introduce today's panelists. Dr. Charmaine Adams is an assistant professor at University of Nebraska, Omaha, and a licensed professional counselor. Both clinically and academically, Adams focuses on social justice counseling and empowering people to examine barriers and use their strengths to overcome life's challenges. Dr. Anitra Warrior is a therapist with Morning Star Counseling. She values cultural heritage and embraces the significance of relationships in our lives. She attended the Little Priest College in Winnebago and has a bachelor's in psychology and a master's and PhD in counseling from UNL. Miguel Estevez is an English, Spanish, and Brazilian Portuguese trilingual therapist, serving young adults and others through programs and therapy at the Friendship House in Grand Island. He believes his background as a first-generation U.S.-born, growing up with parents from Guatemala and El Salvador, helps him understand the Latinx community in a unique way. Welcome, everyone. Let's follow up with that story from Mr. Carmona. First off, thanks to Mr. Carmona for submitting that video, a brave thing to do. You didn't have to, but you did. If mental illness is a taboo in your culture, how do you find a support system? That first question I will direct to you, Miguel.
Yeah, buenas tardes. And yeah, Alex, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it starts with sharing your story. I think that's one of the things that he did of sharing our story and what we're going through. I think predominantly in the Latinx community or Latina community, we're very communal, but there's some taboo kind of conversations that we don't really quite talk about. And mental illness is one of those. And so having those conversations with your peers, of your classmates, and kind of even joking around like, yeah, my parents totally don't get it, is even a sense of relief of being like, okay, I'm not in the same boat, right? And not feeling alone in that same way.
So if you are a parent, Latinx or otherwise, and your child comes to you and tells you that they think they might be suffering from anxiety or even depression and have suicidal thoughts, what should be the ideal way to respond to that situation? Miguel?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure who. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think there's also like a misconception that parents don't want to know about that. And I think Alex kind of alluded that, but saying like, I don't think they're downplaying that. I think just having that honest conversation of, oh, what does that mean? And I think it goes back to education. I think this program is kind of promoting some of that, of how we have those conversations at home and at schools and even in our churches as we predominant Latino community has a pretty background in spirituality and Christian spirituality.
And just to follow up with that, what if you're a friend? What if you're just a peer and someone confides in you that they were having suicidal thoughts? What should be the next steps? And that one also from Miguel.
Okay, and that would recommend, using the hotline. And we had this conversation in the segment before about being able to have that conversation with your peer, with your friend, is a big step. And then having those conversations with your parents or with an adult that you trust is kind of the big step that I would do.
Now, anxiety is a common feeling. Everyone goes through it. Some would even say it's a healthy thing to feel. How does one separate healthy anxiety from a bigger problem? And that one I'll direct to you, Dr. Adams.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having this conversation. It's so important. And so anxiety comes in a wide range of forms, and it is healthy. We all feel anxiety. It's something that's ingrained in us as humans to let us know that there's something that's not right. There's something that's a little bit off in our environment. There's something that's off in our interaction. It's kind of a cue that something needs to change. And so when anxiety moves into a chronic form, that might be stress, and then that moves into distress, and then that moves into crisis. That's where we start to see issues happening for folks. And so anxiety is great when we can kind of pinpoint the issue that we're anxious about, when we can pinpoint a way to alleviate that. But it's that free floating anxiety sometimes that we feel about situations that just can't be resolved that can be really, really troubling. And so sometimes just voicing what we're anxious about, taking a moment to slow down and think, like, what do I need right now? What is my body telling me I need right now? And kind of grounding ourselves in that awareness to try to figure out what we need can be the first step in helping us manage our anxiety. And then if we find that that's just really hard to do on our own, reaching out to friends or family to have those conversations. And then potentially, if you can't alleviate it in that way, then seeking help from a professional, like a mental health professional, school counselors, community counselors.
Is there a certain time period you would put on that? Or if you're experiencing anxiety for X amount of time, then you should probably see somebody?
Yeah, so I wish I had kind of this true metric for you on when you need to seek help for anxiety, but the fact of the matter is all of us have a different set of coping skills. And so all of those different sets of coping skills are going to make it so that we can manage our anxiety for different amounts of time. So folks that have really low resources, folks that have really low internal coping skills, or don't have a lot of social support may need to seek help sooner because they need to have more tools in their toolbox to be able to help manage anxiety. And folks that have more access to resources may be able to kind of lean on their community, lean on their family, lean on their resources and help a little bit more. But I do think that if your anxiety is starting to impact multiple domains of your life, so it's impacting your ability to engage in relationships, it's impacting your ability to eat or sleep, engage with work, engage with things that you enjoy for fun. Those are times that say, okay, so this is more than just typical anxiety. This is something that's actually impacting multiple domains of my life. And so it would be helpful to get a handle on it.
Dr. Warrior, what are your thoughts on it?
I agree with what she's saying in terms of this actually having an impact on your daily functioning. And that's essentially what it comes down to. It's important to think about how anxiety can generalize to other areas in our lives. So it really comes down to our thought process. Anxiety can often be about a fear that we may have. And if we're not challenging that fear or addressing it, it can start to go into other areas of our lives that may be similar. So it can become kind of like a bigger monster than what it has to be. But when we experience those physical symptoms, that makes it a very different and real experience that can't be minimized. And sometimes that's what we see when people are experiencing anxiety or depression. And that's because of the stigma that's associated with it, that people will often minimize those symptoms or what we're experiencing. So realizing how this is impacting what you're doing, your level of communication, your energy, being able to complete daily tasks, that's definitely a strong indicator of when it's time to reach out, to receive help. And just kind of going back to with peers, it's really important to stay with that individual. If someone discloses to you that they are wanting to take their lives, that they have a plan, it's really important to stay with them, to not leave them alone until you're able to get help from a professional or from a teacher or, a teacher or whoever, another adult that may be in the area, but really making sure that you get additional support, but not leaving that individual alone. And with parents as well, I think it's helpful for them to ask details and know that it's okay to not know everything. You don't have to know everything about anxiety, but hear what your child is saying to you and ask them questions and let them know that we can find help. We will look for help. Because again, you're not going to be expected to know everything about anxiety, everything about depression. And I think that can be scary too. If your child is coming to you to tell you they have depression, you don't really know anything about it. how do you appropriately respond? So let's ask some more questions and let's let them know we can get help for you.
And Dr. Ward, I want to stick with you for this next question, because we heard Alex talk about how he perceives in the Latinx community it is something of a taboo to talk about mental illness. Is it common in minority communities for there to be a taboo around mental illnesses, and how do we go about addressing that?
Yes, from my experience and even in my own culture, there's definitely a taboo, but I do see this evolving. And I think part of what's really helped with understanding the power of mental illness is tying it into those physical symptoms. So there are individuals that that I work with, or even individuals in my family that have strong physical symptoms that can't be described by a blood clot, or this is not a heart attack. There is nothing wrong with your lungs. Okay, then we need to reassess what's actually happening, because these are actually symptoms of anxiety. So getting education out there to explain how mental illness or things like anxiety and depression, how these can physically manifest, I think also helps with overcoming that stigma, understanding the power of our mental processes, our cognitions, and the impact that that has on our body. So I think as long as we continue to share that information with our communities, that's starting to make a difference in terms of the stigma that's associated with mental disorders or mental illness. So again, yes, there is definitely that taboo that we see. I for me, at least, in the communities that I serve, we are seeing that evolve because of the education that's being provided throughout.
We have a submitted question I'd like to get to. Dulce from Omaha asks, we lost our youngest son to suicide this past year. We talked daily several times as he lived with us. Everything appeared as if he was happy and had his life on track. I believe this is greatly needed, or what is greatly needed is training for parents and caregivers, teachers, and safety plan contracts on navigating conversations to ensure loved ones are truly doing well. Too much time lapses between hospital visits, therapists, or psychiatric care. There lacks day-to-day care in addition to taking meds. Do you agree, or is there such programming so others can be better prepared? I will direct that one toward Miguel.
Yeah, so there's a mental health aid out there. So it's kind of like CPR that, everybody should know CPR in case of emergency. Mental health aid is a program that's kind of across the nation that's kind of doing that, educating adults of how to have those conversations and how to recognize that. So if you're a soccer coach, or if you're, a youth pastor, how do you recognize some of those things? And so that's a great program that they're doing. And I think we're slowly becoming more aware, just like, it took some time for everybody to kind of know CPR. It's going to take a little bit of time for everybody to know what to do as a mental health aid. And it's a great program. So I would highly, highly check it out. And it's offered all over.
Does anybody else want to comment on it?
Yeah, I think I'd like to start by just saying I'm so sorry for your loss. I think that's we see the impact of suicide not only just from the death of the individual, but how it ripples through families and ripples through communities. And yeah, so I just like to start by saying I'm so sorry for your loss. And to echo what Miguel had said, there's another program called QPR, Question, Persuade, and Refer. And that is a program that's also meant for non-mental health professionals. And so essentially, this program teaches you how to, if somebody is, that there's a lot of different signs for suicide. It's never just one indicator. There are physical signs, there are behavioral signs, there are environmental signs that someone might be thinking about taking their life. And so this program teaches you how to see all of those different risk factors and what to kind of keep your spidey sense up for. After that, it teaches you how to actually engage in those conversations, to invite somebody in to say, I'm noticing that you've been withdrawn. I'm noticing that that you haven't called as much. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. And it helps you to get comfortable in asking, not with euphemisms, not with soft language, but after actually coming out and saying, are you thinking about killing yourself? And there has been plenty of data to show that directly asking somebody if they're thinking about ending their life does not make somebody want to end their life more. It actually does the exact opposite. It makes somebody feel like there's actually an outlet to have a conversation about something that sometimes is wrapped in a lot of shame and a lot of pain. And so after this program teaches you how to have those conversations, the next piece is it teaches you how to refer that person to appropriate levels of care. So the program really leans into what are the local resources that we have and how do you get in touch with them. So question, persuade, and refer is the kind of go-to one that I use for folks. I teach it as kind of the very introductory piece of my crisis and trauma class at UNO, and then go into more advanced skills for the students in that class, but that's one I really highly recommend.
And again, I just want to thank Dulce for submitting that question. I'm sure that was not easy to share. Our second question, a viewer from Lincoln asks, where can non-English speakers seek therapy? Are there any Spanish-speaking therapists, Arabic-speaking therapists, or any therapists with a second language besides English? In order to help our communities, we need to hire more people with these characteristics. I will direct that one to Dr. Warrior.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so at Morningstar Counseling, we do have 2 psychologists who are bilingual. They speak English and Spanish. There are other Spanish-speaking providers throughout Lincoln. There is a website that you could go to, which is psychologytoday.com. And you can put in there that you're seeking a Spanish-speaking or whatever language it may be, but you can put that in there that that's who you're seeking, and it can do a search for you. You also have the option to reach out to some of those therapists. And within Lincoln, there is a large group of therapists who have communication daily. And so if we know of someone who is looking for a particular therapist with a particular cultural or ethnic background, we all work together to try and find the appropriate therapist. And we usually have a number of people volunteering to speak up and help with that. So again, psychologytoday.com is really a good place to start a search in terms of what specific language you're looking for, or any specific type of treatment as well that you would be looking for from a therapist.
Very cool. Miguel, do you have anything to add?
And just partnering with your schools as well. If you're a teenager or your child's in the school, try to talk to the school counselor if they know anybody. Sometimes the schools is more connected with the communities, and they can always send you their way. So that's kind of some of the things that I've been trying to do here in Grand Island, particularly since I'm the only, there's only 2 of us bilingual Spanish-speaking therapists. And so me and the other therapists talk a lot together and send each other people, but also we partner with the schools of being like, hey, we're here. And I know that in rural Nebraska, that could be something that can be a really valuable tool to have.
All right, we're going to move on to our next segment. Thank you guys so much for your responses, and thank you so much to the people who submitted questions for sharing with us. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, please call for help. Go to our resource page at netnebraska.org/wellbeings for numbers and mental health resources across the entire state. Post your questions in the comments and tell us where you're located. For our next video, we're going to be introduced to Nidal Al-Kazahi. She spent most of her young life in the foster care system, and she's also navigating her own mental health, but it's complicated by additional mental illnesses in her family.
A lot of the mental health issues that I have faced in life isn't always my own, but with what my mom went through and what she did. She's bipolar and she's deaf, so it's a lot for her. When I was 5, me and my siblings were all removed from my parents, and we were put into the Nebraska foster care system. It was a really hard time because it was a couple of years after 9/11 happened, and we were a target of a lot of racism. I'm already getting teary-eyed right now. Somebody had made a call and said that my mom was abusing us, and she was. That part wasn't false. But instead of reaching out and giving her mental health help, they just put us in the system and split us all up. One home took 3 of us and another took the other 3. We ended up in the system for 15 years with no chance of reunification. We all still have a very strained relationship with her. She is the reason we were in system, but it's also hard to be around somebody that isn't getting the help that they need. When I was 14, my brother was murdered. It shook the Middle Eastern community. Nothing had really happened to us like that. It just was really, really hard. He's the brother that I lived with when I first was in foster care, and he always took care of me. The other loss was my dad. It was my senior year of high school. That was really hard because I was a daddy's girl. It was so hard because he was my world. My depression used to be so bad, where I would wake up, just open my eyes, and I would just lay in bed all day. Wouldn't even move. I would just stare at a wall. Wouldn't look at my phone when people would call or text. I wanted to move. I wanted to get up, and I just couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to do it. And then I was like, I need to get help. I need to figure out what I can do. And I kind of just figured out ways that work for me. Lots of yoga. It's relaxing. Therapy. Having time for myself. When I come home, I have a day to myself and I'm not making plans with people. I have time to think about it. I have time to shed some tears. I have time to think of memories. I am a Project Everlast Council member. I advocate for foster youth, juvenile justice youth. We just try to find ways to help because we've all gone through it. We all know what it's like. Most of us have had the rough end of it. So we just want to give back. There's this quote that says, God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. I was going through so much. It was the death of my brother, my dad, the system. And then I came across that quote and I was like, wow, I'm pretty damn strong. To the youth that are still in foster care that are struggling to understand their purpose, it's because you're strong.
As you just heard, Nadal is now an advocate for youth in the foster care and juvenile justice systems. She encourages families, especially families of color, to consider becoming foster parents. If children are not allowed to dress or worship the way their culture does, they can be further traumatized, and it'll be difficult for them to rejoin that culture when they reach adulthood. My first question is for Dr. Warrior. What if your parents are suffering from mental illness, and what's the proper way to handle that situation?
Thank you. This one really pulled at my heartstrings thinking about what she had to experience with her mother. And it's important for systems to also be aware. So within the school, for them to have an awareness of what's happening within the home, because what can happen is our children will have to learn different behaviors to get their needs met. So if we have an individual who has bipolar disorder, there may be different things that those children have to do in order to get their needs met at home. And sometimes those can occur in school, and it may be seen as the child acting out. It may be seen as the child having other things happening for them. But it's really important to understand the system and what's happening within the home. So that part, I can't stress that enough, because there are learned behaviors that take place in order for us to meet our needs. So that's really important, I think, to keep in mind first. And when we think about what our parents are experiencing, and again, going back to those systems, what supports are available for them. And schools are so vital in being able to reach out to families to help make referrals. So I would really encourage students as well as their peers and family members. So it doesn't have to just be the parent that is trying to do a self-referral to the school. This could be an older sibling. This could be a relative, an aunt, someone that can reach out to find out how can we get them support to help them be healthy. So, and one of the things that we talked about as we were doing our introduction was the importance of relationships. And that's something that I would encourage, again, is really recognizing relationships within the systems in which we live. So reaching out to the schools, getting the support that you can.
Very good. Dr. Adams, could anything have been done to help Nadine's mom? Could her story have ended differently? And how can children be empowered to make that leap to reach out for help when an authority figure like a parent is suffering?
Yeah, and I think it's so hard to tell if there's anything that could have been done. I think that what we see in this story is a failure of a lot of systems and like generations of systems, right, that have failed communities of color. Generations of systems that have made communities of color believe that seeking help isn't safe, that seeking help isn't for them. Generations of communities of color that have gone to doctors and not have their issues taken seriously, or have been misdiagnosed or overdiagnosed, right? And so I think that we see in this story kind of this tragic piece of how this is passed down from generation to generation. So I think that I could speculate on if anything could have been done for her mother. I think that there's ways that the system could have been more supportive, that there could have been ways to get services to her, especially when they made the decision to take the children out of the home. I think that there's ways that they could have been supported on potential reunification if that was in the best interest of the mother and in the best interest of the children. But I also think that I have very limited information, so I don't want to speculate too much about this. But I do think that there is something to be said about our parents needing support and also just using the resources that they have. They come from a generation where communities of color did not have access to mental health care. And if they did have access to mental health care, it was inadequate. And so I think there is some work that needs to be done by us mental health professionals to scream loud and often that we are here and that we're available and that we're a new generation that's here to support communities of color, however they'd like to show up for us.
I would imagine that's a constant struggle.
It is. It is.
Miguel, what can being abused as a child mean for young people as they approach adulthood? We talked a little while ago about ripple effects. Tammy from Facebook asks, how do we begin to destigmatize mental health in communities of color so people feel more comfortable seeking help?
Yeah, I think Dr. Adams talked about this, about just the trust of people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have with maybe the healthcare system, because sometimes we haven't been taken seriously on some of these things. And I think until we talk about that conversation, I think we can actually start building that trust. So I think this is more of a macro level or more of a systemic kind of conversation. But I think as mental health therapists of color, like just like what we're doing today, just being able to say we're here and like we're reaching out, we want to reach out, but we also need the funding and the support of not only our cities, but also just of the churches that are participating in the community, knowing that to build those trusts, we need everybody together to be able to do that. And I truly believe in that ripple effect of if a smaller community starts talking about mental health, it starts talking about all these issues, we can start moving forward to bigger, and larger. And I really believe the opposite of that ripple effect. But childhood trauma is real, and as someone that has tremendous amount of childhood trauma, I've been affected a lot. But it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of investment from family, from friends, from my church community, and a lot of therapy after it. And there is hope, and there is healing.
That is good to know. Dr. Warrior, targeted racism can affect perceptions of oneself. How does a person begin to process these feelings? I feel like this is a feeling that many people, many minorities have had at some point.
Yes, definitely. And we actually have therapists as well who have experienced that through their supervision, through their training, and some of that has been internalized. And we start to have that, what we would call internalized oppression, where we can start to oppress our own. So being able to identify a mentor that you feel comfortable with, that you're able to share openly about your experience, and also talking with others who have a shared experience with racism. So again, being able to talk about these things, finding people that you're able to trust, is really important in, one, acknowledging it, and two, learning how you're responding to it, how you're interpreting that, also how you're internalizing it is going to be something that we need to be able to address. Something I'd like to go back to, though, if you don't mind. I love what the other two panelists are saying in terms of we need to be louder, we need to, make sure people know that we're here. The other thing that I would share is we also need to think about how we're essentially decolonizing what clinics look like, what our behavioral health service looks like. This is something I cannot stress enough. As a Native person, gift giving, establishing relationships on how we're connected is so important. That's not part of our training. Actually, that's something that is frowned upon in our training. But as an Indigenous person, this is how I am real. This is how I am authentic in developing my relationship with you. And that's something that I will take into the clinic. That's something I will take into the communities that I serve. So really embracing your culture and sharing that and taking ownership of our clinical time and knowing I can be this Indigenous person as a clinician, and that will help me serve you better. I truly believe that's going to make all the difference in how we interact with those that we serve, with how accepted behavioral health services are in our communities. So that was just something I wanted to really push, because I know our clinic hears me talking about decolonize clinical services as much as possible. So I wanted to make sure I had the time to share that as well.
No, that was a magnificent response. Thank you for making the time to make sure you got that out there. I appreciate it. We're going to move on, but before we do, just want to once again thank Nadal and then Tammy from Facebook for submitting the video and then the question. You didn't have to, but you did. Thank you. Next up, we're going to go to Mark Iradukunda. Now, for Mark, imagine being in a new country, thousands of miles away from your family and friends. How do you handle mental illness? It's a reality many international students face.
Mark Iradukunda is a junior at the University of Nebraska. He's part of ASUN, student government, and serves on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Mark is originally from Rwanda and says international students have unique struggles when it comes to mental health.
So you come here, you have a different culture, you want to adapt so that you can, fit in, but then you have your own culture that calls you, hey, don't forget your roots. So it's like living in different worlds. It's hard to connect to Americans fully and then to connect to your country fully. So like we're kind of in between. So maybe I wish people could understand that we do struggle.
But even though international students may be going through some of the biggest emotional struggles on campus, they may be less likely to reach out. Mark says in Rwandan culture, talking about emotions may be perceived as weakness.
Our cultures don't necessarily care about emotional well-being. Like if I'm being honest, they would only understand if I'm angry or I'm happy. But I can say I'm struggling emotions and like that's you weak, like that's weakness. When you come to college, everybody's about like, well, your well-being. You need to take care of your emotions. You need, like, if you feel sad, it's okay. But my culture says no, you gotta be strong. So like it's really hard.
He encourages students who are uncomfortable to use anonymous services like university CAPS, counseling and psychological services. And for people who want to help, Mark says patience with language and cultural barriers goes a long way. He encourages people to reach out to their international friends because those students are less likely to reach out for help themselves.
In US, Like you say, here are the resources, go get them. But back home now, that's not how it works. You bring the resources. Hey Mark, take this. Talk to me, how are classes going? Like, what are you struggling with? And then through the process, because I don't want to share, but if I see that you really, really care about me, then little by little I can share my story, and maybe you can know where to help. I know it's hard, it's hard. You have so many people to help, but one person at a time, it can make a difference.
Mark says that 2020 was a very stressful year for international students. When the pandemic hit, they weren't sure if they'd be able to stay at the university. Also, keep in mind that many of these students are people of color. So add to the mix heightened racial tensions when the Black Lives Matter protests hit a high point last summer. Mark says international students had to be extremely cautious because their immigration status doesn't guarantee them the freedoms that many of their fellow Nebraskans enjoy. My first question is for Dr. Adams. International students, as well as many others, may feel as though they're living in two separate worlds at the same time. What are some good ways to cope with that feeling?
Yeah, I think thinking about the cumulative impact of stress, right? That it's already really challenging to be an international student, to come and try to learn kind of the logistics of the U.S. education system, which kind of baffle U.S.-born students, let alone folks that may not have English as their first language. And so I think that there's first a recognition of just the baseline cumulative stress that's happening for our international students. And then I think there needs to be an appreciation of the strength and resilience that comes from being able to go to a new country where you don't know anybody, to learn in a system that you don't understand. I think our international students carry incredible resources with them, incredible resilience and strength to be able to kind of take this leap. And so I really think that it's important for us to draw on the individual strength that they have and then the cultural strength that they bring with them. Talking about in their home countries, how do you manage stress? How do you manage complicated situations? Let me not just throw all of these tools that I think may be helpful for you, but let's draw on what's already there. I think that whether we're talking about international students or whether we're talking about communities of color in general, these are communities that have resilience and perseverance embedded in them. And so sometimes I think we come in and we think marginalized means analogous to inferior, and that we need to give all of these resources, when really we need to be pulling from these indigenous strengths, these generations of strength and resilience. And so that's where I would start, and I would encourage anybody working with international students or communities of color to start by listening to the strengths they already have and trying to bolster those.
And Dr. Adams, I'm going to stick with you. This is another case of culture difference in addressing mental wellness. We heard that it's not okay in Rwandan culture to bring up mental illness, and that's the same case in many other cultures, as we know. So how does one begin to bridge the gap when, in this case, we're talking about someone who actually lived in a different world, so to speak?
Yeah, and so I think part of that is on our end as mental health providers to let people know what our services are used for. I think sometimes folks only believe that they need to come to us when it's crisis. But really, we want students to come to us when they're starting to feel uncomfortable sitting in class, when they're starting to struggle to stay on top of their classwork, when they're finding that they're struggling to get the sleep that they used to be able to get, or they have a change in their appetite. And so I think the primary piece is understanding that as mental health professionals, we're not just here to help people in crisis. We're here to help folks have holistic wellness, and whatever that means for you. If you want somebody to talk through your spiritual health, your emotional health, right? Like if you want somebody to kind of problem solve with you, how to advocate for yourself with your medical provider, we're here for that too. Or if you just want somebody to just kind of unload the stressors of your life, we're here for that too. So I do think that there's a piece of us educating what we do and what our services can be used for. And then I also think that it's really important that we not only wait for folks to come to us, but also put ourselves out there to say, hey, we know that these are communities that already have cumulative stress, right? We should already be getting in front of international, like programming for international students and saying, hey, we just want to let you know that we're here, and we're going to check in with you again in a couple months when we know midterms are hitting or when we know the end of the semester is hitting. And so I think that's also on us as mental health providers. Like the video said, that we don't just want to passively wait for people to engage with our services. We want to actually go out and invite people into our services and invite them into to let them know what we can be useful for.
I'd be interested to know the panel's opinion on this. Do we think that maybe we should start to think of mental wellness checks the same way we think of the doctor's appointment or dentist appointment, something that you should probably do semi-annually or annually or every so often? I'll start with you, Miguel.
Yeah, the way I describe it to a lot of my dudes that don't want to come to therapy is like, it's like an oil change. You need that. Otherwise, your car is going to like just not work well, right? Or it's like checking your tires, right? It's part of your, you know, a part of your transportation or where you go. And so then that kind of clicks. I'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I'll take that. And so I love that analogy of it's an oil change or a tire rotation, right? Because it's a thing that we continually need to do for our cars. And I think a lot of the guys specifically that are kind of resistant to therapy can kind of like really like think about that. And so I would say yes.
Dr. Adams?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that we provide a wide range of services. We provide preventative services. So maybe you're doing relatively well, but you're having a big life change that's coming up and you just want to talk through that with somebody. That's absolutely a reason to come to therapy. We also do like ongoing maintenance services. So if you know that you have a diagnosed mental illness, maybe it's depression, maybe it's anxiety, and you just need somebody to check in to make sure you're staying on top of taking care of yourself, we do that too. And we do crisis related services when there's something really big that you need immediate help. And so I think that there's a wide continuum of how you can use us, but absolutely just coming and talking and bouncing ideas off of somebody once or twice a year just to get it off your chest, I think is great practice.
Dr. Warrior.
Yes, so what we're seeing in our integrated care facilities, but also just in general care with hospitals and clinics is at the onset of the appointment, you're getting a quick screener in terms of any type of suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety. And these are just a few questions that are checked in on. I think it would be important to really take some time to discuss those, though. So I see that there is an increase in terms of getting screeners out. But I think we have to challenge that even more so, just in terms of now we need to have a discussion about this. Let's also do this in schools. We're currently working with a college who is going to be doing this for all of their students. And they'll have the option to receive services or talk with one of our providers if they're interested. But it's something that will go to every single college student. So I think we have to be able to, again, kind of push that envelope and have those discussions about what are these questions that you're asking or that you're being asked and how are you responding, and being able to have a discussion, because the more we have exposure to this content, to mental health awareness, that the more we're going to be able to reduce that stigma that's associated with it. So I think we're starting to see it. We just have to push it a little bit further in terms of we're not just going to give you the screener and be done with it. We're also going to have a discussion about this, and it's going to happen at many levels across settings.
Very good. All right, we're going to move on to our next video, but again, I want to thank Mark for his submission. Next up, we have Colleen New Hawley from the Lakota Sioux Tribe. What happens when your entire culture endures unspeakable trauma? Colleen New-Hawley talked with us about how she's dealing with depression and anxiety, and about how it stems back to what her parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents experienced.
I am 24 years old. I'm about to be 25 in February. I am from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, enrolled with the Oglala Sioux tribe. When I was growing up, my parents were having a hard time in their marriage. The walls were pretty thin, and we could hear them shouting in the other room. I have 3 other siblings. They're all younger than me. It was my job to make sure they were asleep. So when they finally did separate, my father moved out of the house. And after that, it was just constant change. We experienced homelessness, we've experienced, different types of abuse. It was difficult, especially in middle school for me. Like, I never fit in. It was just really hard. And a lot of that came from, what I later learned was, depression. A lot of people think that depression is being really sad. A lot of times it really is just getting up and going about your day, but you're doing it in a way where you're practically a zombie. You're just so tired. You're just so heavy. I know when people hear about the reservation, first thing people think about is, poor Native people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol and, who live in rundown homes. You need to understand that if you're living in a place where you're far away from resources like grocery stores, places to get new clothing, places to get new items for your household, you're not being supported the way you should be in terms of being able to get mental health services, in terms of being able to get even generalized health services. You feel that hopelessness. You feel like you're not worthy of being alive a lot of times. You don't feel like you're even a real human being. But overall, it really does kind of come back to what's called intergenerational trauma. The things that my grandparents and my great-grandparents experienced, has come down and trickled down to me and my siblings, because they've gone through a lot. My grandmother was in boarding school, for instance. She had a lot of issues that she didn't address that affected how my mother grew up and interacted with people, down to us. We're realizing that a lot of things in the past affects us to this day. And that does stem back to, colonization and what's happened since then. There's a lot of history behind a lot of what troubles a lot of people today.
Colleen says that counseling and journaling have been helpful as she manages her anxiety and depression. I think she hit on some very important points in her video, and my first question is for Dr. Warrior, and it's about the lack of mental health resources in Native American communities. From what you know in your work with those communities, what is the reality of the situation when it comes to mental health resources?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad she highlighted that because there's 3 things that I always highlight, and this is actually from a study that was done by HRSA, but it's accessibility, acceptability, and availability. And those are significant challenges that we see on reservations as well as in rural communities. So there isn't always a lot of ways to recruit providers to these locations. And when they are there, they don't necessarily stay for very long. And when we're talking about working through trauma, we want to be able to have some consistency. And that's not always the case. And so if we're talking about acceptability, but I know I'm going to have a provider for a short amount of time, I'm not really going to open up to this person. That's not helping with me establish trust, to have any belief in what this program can offer. So those 3 areas can really make it a challenge. So again, the shortage of providers remains a significant challenge, which is part of why we're very happy that we have telehealth, that's a bit more accepted now. But what we also run into with telehealth in our rural and reservation communities is the connectivity. So there are still a lot of changes that we have to make if we want to expand services and the availability. We have to be able to have that connection so we can provide those services. But yes, she's absolutely right in terms of having the lack of providers. I know we have one community now that is down to one provider, and it's there's a significant amount of trauma. We are doing the best we can to try and reach out and get other providers available to the community. But something that we definitely see, again, in rural reservations as well as rural communities.
Again, I think you hit on a fantastic point with the rural connectivity and broadband access and all of those things that sort of prevent those telehealth services from taking root. Intergenerational trauma. That is not the first time I've heard that word. Dr. Adams, can you help define what is intergenerational trauma and how it manifests itself?
Yeah, so intergenerational trauma is extremely complex. And so I'm going to start by prefacing that, and that there are entire college courses and entire programs centered around understanding intergenerational trauma. So essentially, this is all still unfolding research. So there are a couple ways that we know that trauma passes down through generations. The first is biological markers. We see this in studies from individuals who were in concentration camps in the Holocaust, and we can see biological markers in generations to come that have to do with stress response, immune system response, and heart function. We also see intergenerational trauma pass from generation to generation through family customs. And so when families are going through a traumatic event, or a specific individual in a family is going through a traumatic event, the family adapts in ways of coping. And those ways of coping are now put into the toolbox of the children and are passed down from generation to generation. The last piece that we see is intergenerational trauma passed down through communities. So a large component of intergenerational trauma is a stripping away of community resources in a systematic way. So we saw that with Indigenous communities, with boarding schools. We saw that with the pulling away of lands, the pulling away of resources. We saw that in African American communities with slavery. We've seen that kind of across the world over, that dismantling individuals' ways of celebrating customs, of gathering, of engaging in religious activities, all of that kind of debases a community, because we pull a lot of strength from those generational customs. We pull a lot of strength from that. And so when that's stripped away, right, we no longer see that pass through generation. So intergenerational trauma is extremely complex. And those are the three main mechanisms that we see in the way that it shows up. And essentially, behaviorally, it shows up in the way that we cope, primarily in the way that we cope with stress. And we also see intergenerational resilience. So we see all of these very creative ways that families have overcome, that families have been resilient and pushed through hard times. And so I think the flip side of intergenerational trauma is intergenerational resilience.
Okay, so intergenerational trauma, even though it is to a certain degree somewhat inevitable, doesn't mean that there aren't ways to resist it and work around it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we see like across the world, kind of the most oppressed communities are often the most creative, right? Like they bring with them these tools in their toolbox on how to work systems that are systematically trying to keep them down. And I think that is something that shows incredible strength and beauty and creativity, and is definitely something that should be honored in the mental health space and outside of it.
Very good. Miguel, how do you see intergenerational trauma play out in the Latino community? And does the macho culture part of that community play into that?
Yeah, it does. The machismo is real in our culture. And I think it goes back to kind of intergenerational trauma, you know, from colonization and slavery and the bad legacy and the bad history of just America as a continent in general. And then on top of that, you start adding civil wars in Latin America, and you start adding, you know, imperialism, and you start adding poverty, because all the resources are getting pulled up to the Western world, right? So not only do they have intergenerational trauma of colonization and slavery, but they also have generational trauma of poverty, but they also have generational trauma of civil wars, right? And so a lot of them, including my father, you know, he was a child soldier in El Salvador, and some of that thing that got passed on was some of his alcohol problems and some of his PTSD that ultimately led to violence at my house. And so, but within that, I also learned some of the positive traits that my father had, which he was creative. You know, he was an orphan and grew up in the streets and grew up in the Civil War, and he figured out some of that resilience part of himself, and that really got passed on to me of why I'm so, you know, creative in some of the unique ways that even Dr. Adams was mentioning. And I think that's some of the unfortunate part of machismo. And I think us Latina and Latinx people are starting to have these conversations of intergenerational trauma, but we're also having some of these conversations of colorism and racism within our own culture. And then we're also having some of these patriarchal kind of machismo kind of systems but we're early in these stages. And I think millennials and Gen Z are definitely the ones that are really like having these conversations, and I'm really grateful even for TikTok and the way they, like, if you get a TikTok, they'll drop some knowledge there. You're like, man, how did this 14-year-old know about intergenerational trauma? Good for you.
And sort of as we begin to have these discussions within our communities, do you think that we're on a path to overcoming intergenerational trauma, or is that just one of those things that can't be overcome just because of the history of it? All you can really sort of do is resist it and work around it. Can it be defeated, I guess, is what I'm asking. And that's for you, Miguel.
I am hopeful. I think that's where my sense of like hopelessness kicks in, where I'm like, it's never going to get better. But we can be hopeful. I think we have to be hopeful. We have to see the strength of our ancestors and the strength of the 400, 500 plus years of oppression, and that we're still kicking and we're still going, right? And it might not look pretty, and we might be coping in some ways that are not healthy, but we're still going. And I think we're moving to a direction that we are continually healing as women get more access to education, as more Indigenous and Black people get more education, that we're having these more conversations of accessibility that we didn't even have even in the 60s or 70s. So we're still in the early stages, but I'm hopeful for all of our communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that healing can happen. And
we're going to move on to our last video, but before I do, thanks again to Colleen for submitting her video. If you're a teen battling depression, a supportive family can make all the difference. To prove it, meet Jama.
I'm Jama. I'm South Sudanese American. I'm a sophomore at LHS. I like to read. I have 2 guinea pigs, and I have a big family. It probably began to maybe around 5th grade. I just noticed like that I was just like really down a lot. I wasn't happy. I was just kind of doing things because I had to, not because I enjoyed them. I just lost a lot of interest in the things that I usually love. I told my pediatrician of like how I was feeling, and he recommended that I start going to therapy. My mom was like also there when I was like telling how I felt, so she kind of just learned at the same time as the doctors did. She's different from many other South Sudanese parents. I've talked to like my other South Sudanese people I'm friends with, and their parents really do not believe in mental health, but my mom does believe in mental illnesses, and I just feel like my experience differs a lot because my mom is so supportive of my journey. She really likes the idea of therapy, and she loves that I go to therapy, and she always likes to like talk to my therapist and learn like how I've been doing. When I first got put on medication, my mom was very against that. She's a very traditional African woman. They don't really believe in like taking medicine, but she was still like willing to let me try. And I've been through maybe about like 7 different medications, but I finally found one that really works with me right now. It's been really good. I don't get down like pretty much at all anymore. I'm just able to, not be as anxious. I just feel all around better. I feel like a normal teenager now.
Thank you so much, Jama, for sharing. Dr. Adams, I'd like to start with you. One thing that Jama highlighted was that she experimented with several drugs before she found one that was suitable for her. When we talk about experimenting with medication, what is the proper way to do that, and how do you know when you have found the right medication for you?
Yeah, and so I want to make sure I stay in my lane here because I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a counselor, right? So my training is not in a medical background. So I want to frame it with that. But the way that I talk to my clients about medication is that it does sometimes take a couple different combinations of medications to find one that really works for depression. And so all of this should be done under the medical guidance of a psychiatrist or your general practitioner. But oftentimes they'll start you on a medication that tends to work for most people. And there's a wide variety of types of antidepressants. There's SSRIs, there's atypical, and then there's some off-label medications that we use for antidepressants also. So having those conversations with your doctor about what is the right fit to start off at. And then typically it's gonna be a couple weeks to a month or so before they can really assess if that's working. And so the important thing as a consumer at that point is to really track any sort of side effects that you're having. I encourage to my clients to write down in their phone or on a piece of paper how they're feeling physically, emotionally throughout this process so that they can have an informed conversation with their doctor when they go back for the follow-up. So in the follow-up, then the conversation is really about advocating for yourself. Advocating and making sure that you're really clear about what's working and what's not working and not becoming discouraged, because it can take up to 3, 4, 5 months to find the combination that's going to work for you. But what we know, especially for depression though, is that the best combination is a medication that takes care of the physiological symptoms of depression, like low motivation, impacts your sleep schedules, impacts your eating, impacts your ability to really kind of get up and get moving, but also having therapy to help really come at the cognitive component and the emotional component of the depression. So in tandem, those two can work really, really well. And so having a behavioral health professional that can kind of keep you going until the medication gets on the right track can be really helpful too.
Very good. This one I want to direct toward, well, anyone can answer, but I want to direct it toward Dr. Warrior. This is a question from Facebook, and it simply asks, how do I convince my teen son to go to therapy?
Oh, that's a tough one.
We should preface it by, how do you convince a teen to do anything? But go ahead.
Right? So that can be very tough. Giving them a choice in this, in terms of who you want to meet with is a good start. It could be meeting with a male therapist. It could be meeting with a female therapist, whomever they may feel the most comfortable with. The other piece is also letting them interview that person. That's something that we practice pretty regularly. We go into the schools and we'll meet with students and let them just interview us and see if they fit and if they feel like we would be a fit. And if we don't, we let them know that we can help you find someone that you might feel more comfortable with. And sometimes we meet a couple times without it being about therapy. It's just, let's just get to know each other. But that's, again, our style. That's more of an indigenous perspective, I would say, in terms of establishing a relationship. But I would encourage that to happen because in your treatment, you have a say, just like with what Dr. Adams was saying, write these things down, what are happening, share that with your provider, advocate for yourself. That's what we would also want the adolescents to do, especially when we think about their stage of development and they kind of know everything. They know, what they need to do, even though they don't, but giving them that choice and giving them that say can really make a difference in their level of acceptance for those services.
Miguel, you have a history with seeing young male clients. What do you have to add to this?
Yeah, one, I tried to get their parents, especially their Spanish speaking, kind of together. And we kind of have this Spanglish kind of first 10, 20 minutes talking about what's going on to one, build a trust with the family members, but also with the teenager. And then I talked to both of them about some of the what do they want me to work with or what's going on at home. And then after they leave, I really tell their parents like, hey, let me gain some trust. Like, let me get to know them and you know, let's work together. And so when they leave, a lot of the things I joke around, especially with my male teenagers, I'm like, hey, I don't want to snitch on you. So like, what do you want to work on? And they kind of laugh. They're like, oh, thank God. You're not, you know, it's like, of course, you know, I did the, you know, informed consent and everything like that. And here's some of the parameters, but let's kind of dig into it. And I think realness, I think maybe that's some of the privilege I have as male, that I could just kind of be a little bit more real and just be like, you know, what's going on? And just kind of like, I think they really resonate with that. And I think teenagers can kind of cut through who's being real with them and who's not being real with them. And I think realness kind of really goes a long way, not only as a mental health therapist, but also just kind of a school therapist and other entities that are part of the mental health kind of system.
And Miguel, is it the same sort of thing with medication where you might have to shop around a little bit before you find the right therapist that'll work for a particular person, especially a young person?
Yes. And I think you should strongly advocate for a therapist that you fit. And that you like their style, or that you just get along. Sometimes I just don't get along, and that's okay. And I always bring that up. Hey, if we don't click and you need to find someone, like, it's okay, you know. And I always recommend them to Adriana, which is the other bilingual therapist in town. I'm like, go check them out and see which one you like better. And like, again, for me, it's more important for them to find a therapist that they feel comfortable with than like them having to come to me. And sometimes they click again with maybe gender or even ethnicity or even your style. You know, they're like, oh, like I joke around with them. I'm like, yeah, I like to joke around a lot. And if you don't like that, well, that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from Facebook, this one from Grace. Could you talk about trauma carried in genetics as well as resilience carried in the DNA? Dr. Adams, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so I think we could have a whole talk about how trauma is carried in genetics. And I think that conversation centers around the conversation around intergenerational trauma. Primarily the research that I have read has shown that when we're talking about how trauma perpetuates through our genetics, it's often in kind of our window of tolerance, how well we can tolerate stressful situations. And so that is kind of like a built-in system that we have as babies, right? You can see that anybody who's had a small child around, there's some babies that are able to self-soothe easier than other babies that tend to kind of be thrown off by even just kind of the smallest noises or the smallest movements. And so we can start to see at a very early age that there's just kind of this built-in window of our ability to tolerate situations that we feel are stressful. And so that's kind of the basis of when we can feel if something is going to be stress, turning into distress, turning into crisis, turning into a trauma experience. So the literature on how to understand how trauma is passed down genetically is very, very complex again, but that's essentially the basis of it. It's passed down in how we respond to stressful situations. And then of course that window of tolerance can be increased or decreased throughout our lifetime based on the coping skills that we engage with in our environment. Our social support systems, our therapists, our teachers, our friends, all of those different pieces can impact how well we feel like we can manage stressful situations, and what's gonna just be an annoyance and what's gonna throw us completely off our axis and end up being a crisis and potentially have long-term impacts that would be a trauma.
Thanks so much. We are running short on time, but we do have time for a few quick questions. The question for each of the panelists. Sarah from Omaha asks, what ideas do you have to encourage people of color to pursue careers in the helping professions, particularly counseling and social work? Miguel?
I always try to give my email to anybody. And like ask first a counselor of color. and ask them what does it look like. I think that's getting to hear the story of a therapist of color. They can kind of understand, and I think even now, I always like to say representing is good. It's not the all, but it helps, right? And so even I think even people that are watching today are even probably thinking like, oh, I can be a therapist. That's something I can think about. So so pointing them out to like therapists of color or other mentors that are thinking into the social work realm too. And I think YouTube, Instagram, there's a lot of awesome Black, Indigenous people of color on Instagram and TikTok that people can follow and just kind of get to see some of that. So using some of the technology that we have too.
Dr. Warrior, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I'm going to have to step up with my Instagram and TikTok game. I'm not on there, so I need to see what's up. So for us, we definitely have a shortage of Indigenous providers. And part of what we do is we partner with the tribal colleges to provide a camp that started out in Western Nebraska by Dr. Catherine Jones Hazeldine. And she's allowed us to modify this for our Indigenous communities. And so we actually go into the high schools, we talk about the careers that are within the field of psychology, and talk about how long you have to be in school, what the salaries are, the challenges, the rewards from these careers. And then we actually provide them graduate level material for about a week, and they receive free college credit free credit for their participation in this. So that's something that we're attempting to do. We've done this successfully, I would say, for 4 years now. And in Western Nebraska, they've had the program for much longer. But that's one way that we can do that, is to really have our providers go in and reach out to these students and really just kind of take that responsibility, because we're needed. You're needed. So going out with the outreach, I think, would make a huge difference.
And Dr. Adams, it's time for us to wrap, but really briefly, in a couple of seconds, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just having educators of color is the first piece of it. And so I hope that me just being at UNO's counseling department shows other little Black and brown girls that there's someone here to support them. There's someone here that looks like them, and they welcome in this space.
Very good. Thanks to all of you for being on this panel. I appreciate it. I've been talking with Miguel Estevez from the Friendship House in Grand Island, Dr. Charmaine Adams from University of Nebraska at Omaha, and Dr. Anitra Warrior from Morning Star Counseling. And thank you for joining our well-beings discussion about mental health in communities of color. Remember, take care of yourself and take care of each other.